It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a tremor beneath the surface of Moscow's morning calm. A familiar hum of engines, the steady rhythm of a capital city just awakening to another workday. No one suspected that within moments, one of the highest-ranking military officers of the Russian Federation would meet his end in a flash of fire and twisted metal. The name, Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov, would soon dominate headlines, social media feeds, and late-night political panels. But at that instant, all that existed was the blinding light of an explosion on Yasenyeva Street and a stunned silence that followed. Witnesses recall seeing a vehicle engulfed in flames near a residential complex, its shattered frames scattering debris across the parking lot. Within minutes, law enforcement and emergency services flooded the scene, cordoning off the area as investigators began their grim task. There were whispers. Was this an accident, an assassination, or something far more orchestrated? The truth, as it turned out, would pierce deep into the fragile illusion of security within Russia's own heartland. Because this was not the first time such a blast had echoed across the city, and tragically, it would not be the last. Reports soon confirmed what many had feared. The target was not random. Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov, head of operational training for Russia's armed forces, was killed instantly when an explosive device planted beneath his vehicle detonated as he started the engine. The timing was precise, the method familiar, and for those who had followed similar incidents over the past year, the pattern was undeniable. Moscow, a city long considered the fortress of the state's power, was witnessing a series of strikes that went straight for the military elite. Inside Russia's pro-government media sphere, panic and disbelief spread rapidly. Prominent Z-bloggers and propagandists, usually quick to proclaim strength and unity, began to question the very system they defended. How could such high-profile killings take place in the capital, against those supposedly protected by the state's most secretive and powerful agencies? And more importantly, why was there no comparable retaliation? In the shadow of Sarvarov's death, these questions grew louder, sharper, more dangerous, even for those asking them. But to understand the shockwave that followed, one has to look back. Over the past 12 months, two other Russian lieutenant generals, Igor Kirillov and Yaroslav Moskalik, had already been killed under strikingly similar circumstances. Each death followed a predictable choreography: an explosion, a brief investigation, an official statement blaming foreign agents, and a rapid return to silence. Yet this time, something was different. The number: 13. 13 senior Russian officers killed deep within their own territory since the war began. That figure, repeated in hushed tones across social media, became a symbol of something larger, a creeping realization that no one, not even the architects of the invasion, was untouchable anymore. What unfolded next was not just a political crisis, but a psychological one. Russian social media spaces, particularly those devoted to military and nationalist commentary, turned into arenas of collective reckoning. Some voices blamed Ukraine's intelligence services, describing them as daring and meticulously strategic. Others turned their anger inward, accusing Russian security agencies of negligence, incompetence, even apathy. "Our generals are dying in Moscow," one blogger wrote, while the FSB hunts Telegram users for comments. Another lamented, "We can't protect our own, but we chase ghosts on the internet." Meanwhile, officials maintained a stoic facade. The Investigative Committee of Russia released a statement suggesting foreign involvement, while Kremlin spokesmen refused to speculate further. Vladimir Putin, notably, offered no immediate comment, a silence that only fueled further speculation. To some, it was a sign of control. To others, of detachment. But among Russia's increasingly anxious elite, it was a reminder that even the most decorated were vulnerable, and the state's once formidable security apparatus was showing cracks. Online, a different kind of conversation began taking shape, one that mixed paranoia with bitter introspection. Z channels filled with posts lamenting the country's lack of counterintelligence discipline, the casual exposure of officers' personal data, and the complacency of a system too absorbed in bureaucracy to notice its own unraveling. "We used to think our enemies were abroad," one commentator wrote. "Now it seems they're right here, in our blindness." As the day turned into night, Moscow's streets returned to their cold, indifferent rhythm. The smoke had cleared, the charred remains of the general's vehicle removed, and the site cleaned as if nothing had ever happened. But the unease lingered, the whispers persisted, and the same unspoken question echoed across the country. If a general could die so easily in Moscow, what did that say about the war, about the state, about everything Russians had been told to believe? Before we reveal the full story, the details behind the explosion, the investigation, and the cascading fallout shaking Russia's military command, make sure you stay with us. Subscribe, share, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this unfolding investigation. What comes next will expose not only how this assassination happened, but why it has sent tremors through the Kremlin itself. To be continued. When the first official statements appeared, they were cautious, almost perfunctory. A car explosion, one confirmed fatality, an ongoing investigation. Yet even before the investigative committee released its findings, it was clear that the target was not a random victim of circumstance. Vanil Sarvarov was a key figure inside Russia's military hierarchy, holding one of the most sensitive positions in the Ministry of Defense. As head of the Directorate of Operational Training, his work touched nearly every major military exercise, strategy simulation, and internal war readiness assessment across Russia's armed forces. His career stretched from Chechnya to Syria, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the deserts of Deir ez-Zor. To those who knew him, he was both a survivor of old wars and an architect of new ones. Born in 1969 in the Perm region, Sarvarov's ascent was methodical, shaped by years of frontline experience and bureaucratic loyalty. He graduated from the Kazan Higher Tank Command School, served in both Chechen wars, and earned promotions through his participation in Russia's intervention in Syria. When he was appointed by presidential decree to his latest role, it was considered a reward for his diligence and dependability. Yet the very qualities that made him a trusted officer also made his death an unbearable embarrassment for the Kremlin. A high-ranking general assassinated in peacetime Moscow, far from any front line. By noon, Russian state channels began their usual choreography of damage control. Anchor after anchor repeated the same script: Ukrainian sabotage group, terrorist act, foreign orchestration. Yet the language seemed forced, as though even they no longer believed in the infallibility of their own institutions. Commentators loyal to the state grew defensive, trying to present the incident as an isolated tragedy rather than evidence of systemic decay. But outside of television studios, the narrative was unraveling fast. Telegram exploded with discussions, and Z channels that once echoed Kremlin propaganda began openly questioning how Ukraine's intelligence services could operate so freely inside the Russian capital. Some accounts drew comparisons with previous assassinations. Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, head of the Radiation and Chemical Defense Forces, who died under similar circumstances in Moscow, and Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskalik, killed in April in Balashikha. The pattern was undeniable. These were not symbolic attacks. They were strategic eliminations. Each target occupied a crucial node in Russia's war structure, and each death deepened the perception of failure among the elites. 3 generals in a year, all inside Moscow or its suburbs, wrote one disillusioned pro-war blogger. That's not coincidence, that's infiltration. Others went further, accusing the FSB and the Ministry of Defense of gross incompetence, even corruption. "We can't guard our own generals, but we can hunt students for posts on Vkontakte," one journalist noted bitterly. It was a rare moment of unity between Russia's war hawks and its silent dissenters. both sides agreeing that something inside the state was rotting. Even among those closest to the regime, cracks began to show. Military correspondents who built their reputations glorifying the invasion now found themselves asking dangerous questions. Why are generals driving old cars without security? Wrote Roman Romanov, a prominent Z telegrammer. Why do they live in ordinary Moscow apartment blocks, while oligarchs and deputy ministers sit behind gates and guards? The post, shared thousands of times before it was deleted, struck a nerve. It painted a stark picture of a system that rewarded loyalty with neglect, of men who commanded divisions but lived like ordinary citizens, unprotected and expendable. As evening fell, Kremlin officials privately acknowledged what they would not say publicly. This was the third confirmed assassination of a general-level officer on Russian soil since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. Each case had followed an eerily similar sequence: an explosive device placed under a personal vehicle, a swift but fruitless investigation, and a muted funeral attended by lower-level officials. Vladimir Putin's response had grown increasingly detached. When Igor Kirillov was killed in 2024, Putin called it a serious failure of the security apparatus. When Moskalik died in April, he sent only a wreath. For Sarvarov, there was silence. Yet within the silence, there was fear. Sources inside the Russian military community described an atmosphere of paranoia and self-protection. Officers began varying their routes, changing cars, refusing public appearances. Some even relocated their families out of Moscow. "It feels like the capital is no longer safe," one colonel reportedly said in a private chat group. "If they can reach generals here, they can reach anyone." Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence officials offered no direct comment, but anonymous statements to Western media suggested that these operations were part of a broader campaign, not of terror, but of targeted disruption against those most responsible for the war. Inside Russia, however, the narrative fractured. Hardline propagandists demanded immediate retaliation. They called for strikes against Kyiv, the bombing of Ukrainian infrastructure, the reintroduction of martial law in Moscow. "If our generals are dying in the capital, we must respond on their soil," thundered one commentator on Tsargrad TV. But their outrage collided with a darker undercurrent, the sense that Russia had already lost something far more critical than a general. It had lost control of its own image of power. A striking irony emerged. For years, the Kremlin had portrayed its intelligence services, the FSB, GRU, SVR, as omnipotent defenders of the homeland. Yet now, their failures were laid bare. In the Z community, once a bastion of uncritical loyalty, the tone shifted to disillusionment. "They can't protect a general's car, but they can wiretap an entire nation," wrote Dmitry Steshin. This is what happens when fear replaces competence. Another prominent blogger compared Russia's security agencies to overheated computer boards, sealed, outdated, impossible to repair without tearing the whole system apart. The anger was no longer confined to fringe voices. Even military loyalists like Alexander Kotz began to express unease. "How many times must this happen before someone acts?" he asked in a Telegram post that was later quietly edited. "The war has come home, and our generals are dying not at the front, but in our own streets." It was the kind of statement that would once have been unthinkable. Now, it resonated with millions. And then came the most damning comparison of all. Across Russian social media, users began to juxtapose two images. On one side, Sarvarov's modest apartment block and his dented Kia sedan. On the other, the lavish mansion of Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov, surrounded by luxury cars. The contrast was obscene. "This is what loyalty looks like in Putin's Russia," one viral post declared. "A general dies in a parking lot. A bureaucrat feasts in a palace." Even Tsargrad TV, typically one of the Kremlin's most loyal platforms, published an unusually critical editorial, questioning why oligarchs enjoyed better protection than generals defending the state. It was a moment of dangerous candor that no amount of censorship could easily erase. Meanwhile, speculation grew about the exact nature of the attack. Investigators suggested a remotely detonated explosive, likely attached beneath the car during the night. Some reports indicated that the device was triggered via a phone signal. The precision and timing suggested professional execution, a hallmark of experienced operatives. Several security experts quietly acknowledged that the sophistication of the attack pointed toward Ukraine's intelligence apparatus. But even that admission carried humiliation. If foreign agents could operate so freely in Moscow, what did that say about the competence of Russian counterintelligence? As new details surfaced, the story took on an even darker tone. A leaked internal memo, circulated among security agencies, described the incident as a critical failure of situational control. It warned that systemic complacency among senior officers had made them vulnerable. The document recommended heightened surveillance, relocation of command personnel, and increased security awareness training. Yet behind these sterile phrases lay a more chilling truth. No one inside Russia's military elite felt safe anymore. And perhaps that was the point. Each assassination chipped away at the illusion of strength. Each explosion made the Kremlin's promises sound emptier. "Our space is no longer secure," wrote one analyst. "The front has moved to our streets." The words were meant as a warning. But for many watching from afar, they sounded like an epitaph for a regime beginning to implode under the weight of its own contradictions. Before we continue to the final part, where we'll explore the broader implications of these assassinations, the growing rift inside Russia's power structure, and the chilling conversations happening behind closed doors in Moscow, make sure to stay subscribed. The third part will reveal how this wave of killings could reshape the war, the state, and even the fragile equilibrium inside the Kremlin itself. As days passed, the atmosphere inside Moscow thickened with unease. Official television reports tried to move the story to the background, filling the airwaves with footage of military parades, patriotic songs, and smiling politicians visiting orphanages. Yet beneath that carefully polished surface, the shock from the death of Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov continued to reverberate through every corridor of power. Conversations in ministries, army units, and private telegram channels returned again and again to the same haunting question. If the country could not defend its generals in its own capital, what kind of defense could it promise anyone else? The city itself seemed to reflect this tension. Security checkpoints appeared around key government buildings, and anonymous men in civilian clothes began standing near entrances to the Ministry of Defense complex. Military officers avoided giving interviews, and those who did spoke only in vague bureaucratic phrases. An entire generation of officers who had built their careers in the Soviet tradition of discipline and secrecy suddenly found themselves living in a state of suspicion and exposure. "Everyone is looking over their shoulder now," said one source close to the security services. "Nobody knows who might be next." Inside Russia's parliament, the reaction bordered on absurd. A deputy from the State Duma's Defense Committee, Andrei Kolesnik, publicly suggested that generals should inspect the undersides of their vehicles with mirrors before every drive. The remark triggered an avalanche of ridicule, even from pro-Kremlin commentators. "Imagine a general crawling under his car with a mirror while his neighbors film him," wrote one Telegram user. "That's not security, that's humiliation." Others pointed out the grotesque symbolism of a government that could send troops into war, but could not provide its own leaders with a single trained bodyguard. The proposed mirror law quickly became a metaphor for the entire state, improvised, outdated, and utterly detached from reality. At the same time, Russian propaganda outlets tried to reinterpret the assassination as proof of Western hostility. Commentators on RT and Sputnik declared that the Kyiv regime, supported by NATO intelligence, had penetrated Russian territory with unprecedented boldness. But as the rhetoric grew harsher, the cracks within the narrative widened. Journalists and analysts who once dismissed criticism of the war began to acknowledge a deeper structural collapse. "This is not just about Ukrainian sabotage," wrote one columnist in Nezavisimaya Gazeta. "This is about the decay of institutions that were supposed to protect us. The tragedy of General Sarvarov is not that he died, but that his death revealed the emptiness behind the illusion of control." In private, members of the military community spoke of a generational divide. The older officers, many of whom served in Afghanistan and Chechnya, could not comprehend how digital exposure, social media profiles, leaked databases, careless photographs had turned them into targets. Younger soldiers, raised in the era of smartphones and surveillance, understood all too well. Ukrainian intelligence had adapted to a world where information itself was a weapon. Russian officers, however, continued to post pictures from banquets, use traceable devices, and register under real names. As one Z-blogger bitterly admitted, "We've armed our enemies with our own vanity." And yet, the anger was not directed solely at Ukraine. Increasingly, it turned inward. Commentators began to write about a country divided between those who fight and those who feed on the system. Photos comparing Sarvarov's modest apartment in southern Moscow to the opulent estate of Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov spread across Telegram. One post on Tsargrad's channel read, "On the left, the home of a soldier. On the right, the palace of a parasite." The contrast struck at the moral foundation of the regime itself. Even within loyalist circles, the notion that honest generals die while oligarchs dine became impossible to suppress. A particularly damning editorial from Tsargrad TV demanded an investigation into why military leaders received less protection than businessmen and politicians. For 25 years, the state has defended wealth, not service, it declared. "We have built walls around corruption, not around courage." The statement was extraordinary, not because of its content, but because of its source. Tsargrad, once one of the most fervently nationalist channels, was now publicly questioning the moral legitimacy of the Kremlin's priorities. The line between loyalty and dissent had begun to blur. Meanwhile, within the Ministry of Defense, morale plummeted. Senior staff reportedly demanded stricter security protocols and relocation to guarded compounds outside Moscow. Yet such measures only deepened public resentment. The idea that generals would retreat to gated fortresses while ordinary citizens faced drone attacks and conscription summonses fueled the perception of a growing divide between rulers and ruled. "They build bunkers for themselves and leave us to dig trenches," wrote one soldier's wife on Kontaktya before her account was removed. The cycle of distrust grew, feeding a quiet but unmistakable crisis of faith in the very system that claimed to defend the nation. The Ukrainian side remained silent, offering neither confirmation nor denial. Western analysts, however, suggested that the assassination campaign inside Russia had a psychological dimension beyond the immediate military effect. Each successful strike amplified the sense of vulnerability, forcing Moscow to divert enormous resources toward internal security. "They are bleeding Russia from within," said a European intelligence officer cited by Le Monde. "Every general killed in Moscow is worth a dozen tanks lost in Donetsk. It shakes the perception of power." The statement spread rapidly online, provoking fury in Russian nationalist circles. Yet even the most patriotic voices could not deny its logic. As public pressure grew, Kremlin loyalists sought to restore order through patriotic spectacle. State media aired documentaries about fallen heroes, complete with solemn orchestral music and interviews with family members. Portraits of Sarvarov appeared in military academies, framed in black. Yet these gestures only reinforced the tragic irony. In death, he had received the respect that his life's work never did. For many Russians, his fate symbolized the quiet cruelty of a system that glorified sacrifice only after it became irreversible. Outside Moscow, whispers of reform began circulating among mid-level officers. Some proposed a full restructuring of counterintelligence operations. Others went further, calling for a declaration of martial law and a purge of internal corruption. "We are losing not because our enemies are stronger," one colonel wrote anonymously, "but because our own house is collapsing." Yet those calls found no echo in the upper echelons. Putin's silence remained unbroken, his only gesture a wreath sent to Sarvarov's funeral under the Kremlin's official seal. To those present at the burial, it felt less like honor and more like a quiet act of erasure. In the weeks that followed, a new pattern emerged. Security forces arrested several low-level suspects, migrant workers, a mechanic, and a delivery driver, claiming they had, unknowingly, assisted in the placement of the explosive. None of them, however, appeared to have any link to intelligence networks. The arrests were widely seen as an attempt to produce results rather than justice. "They need someone to blame," commented the independent outlet The Insider. But the real failure lies higher, among those whose only skill is surviving inside bureaucracy. By then, the public's interest had begun to fade, replaced by a weary cynicism. The story became another entry in the long catalog of Russia's internal contradictions. A nation that glorifies strength, but breeds fragility. Yet even as the media moved on, the consequences of the assassination continued to ripple outward. Within Ukraine, military commentators interpreted the event as proof that their counterintelligence operations were achieving strategic depth. In Europe, intelligence analysts described it as an inflection point, evidence that Moscow's vast security network could be penetrated repeatedly. And inside Russia, the unspoken fear was that this was only the beginning. The invisible front, as some Z channels began to call it, had now reached the capital itself. There would be more explosions, more funerals, more wreaths laid in silence. Late at night, in private groups, the tone of conversation shifted from outrage to fatalism. "They told us the war would stay far away," wrote one user. "Now it lives next door." Others shared warnings and amateur guides on how to inspect vehicles, change routines, and avoid surveillance. For a country once obsessed with projecting power, these gestures of self-preservation marked a quiet collapse of confidence. Power no longer looked like victory parades and patriotic slogans. It looked like fear. And yet, amid all this despair, a single uncomfortable truth persisted. Sarvarov's death was not just a story about intelligence failures or internal chaos. It was the reflection of a deeper rot, a system that consumes its own defenders while shielding its abusers. From the empty apartments of dead generals to the guarded mansions of Moscow's elite, Russia's contradictions now stood in the open for everyone to see. Each explosion, each funeral, each public denial only sharpened the image of a state at war with itself. The story of Fanil Sarvarov, the 13th senior officer killed in his own country's capital, is more than another chapter in the war's tragedy. It is a portrait of a nation where silence has replaced strategy, where fear has become policy, and where even those sworn to defend the state can no longer count on it for protection. As Moscow's lights glow over quiet streets and its leaders retreat into guarded compounds, one question remains unanswered. Not who placed the bomb, but who allowed the country to reach the point where generals die alone in their cars, and the only response is another moment of silence.